This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Anna Vanscoik. I am a librarian at the Hopewell branch for the Mercer County Library System. And normally I bring to everyone's attention upcoming virtual events, but tonight I wanted to invite all of you to the Mercer County Library System's inaugural book festival, which is going to be taking place at the Lawrence headquarters branch on Saturday, September 27th from 10 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. At this event, you'll be able to meet local authors, get the inside scoop on writing and publishing, and discover your great next read. There's going to be crafts and some kid-friendly performances offered. So we invite you to bring your whole family and celebrate stories with all of us. I will put the link into the chat so you can look to see the authors that are coming, the workshops that are being offered, and all kinds of details to give you an idea of what's going to be going on throughout that day. And of course, as always, I want to invite you to visit our website to locate other virtual program offerings like the one we're having this evening, as well as all the events that are taking place at the 9 branches of the Mercer County Library System. And I will go ahead and put that link into our chat as well. So for this evening, we have what did we learn and when did we learn it? The history of public education in Lawrence Township. And it's presented this evening by Dennis P. Waters. Dennis is an author, scientist, and retired internet entrepreneur. His first book, Behavior and Culture in One Dimension, was published by Routledge in 2021. He is a visiting scientist at Rutgers University, studying the lichens of central New Jersey. For 12 years, he was the township historian in Lawrenceville, and he currently represents Lawrence Township on the Mercer County Library Commission. Thank you so much, Dennis. I'm going to pass it off to you.
And thank you, Anna. And I would second what Anna has said about the inaugural Mercer County Library System Book Fair coming up on the 27th of September, which is a Saturday. And that looks like it's going to be terrific for a first time out. And hopefully it'll be successful if you all participate, and we will be able to do one of these every year. Welcome to Back to School Night. Like the school day, our program this evening is going to be organized into periods. And like the school day, a bell will ring when it is time to change periods. We have a bell. So one thing you may notice as we proceed this evening is how many of the questions that are facing public education going back 200 years are really the same issues that we face today. Who is to be educated and where, and who has to pay for it, and who gets to decide. So our story is going to begin with first period, which I call from private to public. Now, the first mention of a school in what was then Maidenhead Township was in the colonial period in 1742, where a deed mentioned the existence of a schoolhouse lot near the intersection of today's 206 and Carter Road. Now, we actually have no idea if there was ever a school there, but we know there was at least a lot, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And we'll put the early schools up on this present day map so that you can orient yourself. So here is the 1742 schoolhouse lot. In 1771, there was another deed that mentioned a schoolhouse on land owned by John Smith, which was near the intersection of today's 206 and I-295. This school appears to have operated into the early 1800s. The school and lot were sold in 1808, and the proceeds were used to build a new school in the village of Maidenhead. So this is the John Smith School. In that year, 1808, 7 local men founded what was to become the Central School on land that is now part of the Lawrenceville School campus. A couple of years later, these same 7 men would go on to found the Maidenhead Academy, which is now the Lawrenceville School. The original Central School was located more or less across Main Street from where TJ's Pizza is today. The original building was of wooden frame construction and remained in use until 1821, when it was moved to Louisville Road for use as a barn. The replacement building was made of stone and lasted until mid-century. So we will swap the John Smith School for the new Central School. Now, around 1810, another school was started out on the brand new Trenton-Brunswick Straight Turnpike near the intersection of today's Texas Avenue and Brunswick Avenue. This was called the Oak Hill School. In 1832, the Oak Hill School was demolished, and the materials were used in construction of a new schoolhouse on the Princeton Turnpike. And this was the Brick School, sometimes called the Valley School. And it's the only school building from this period that is still standing. This advertisement for a teacher was dated 1848 from the Brick School. Originally a single 20 by 24 foot room, the Brick School was renovated and expanded in the 1880s. It continued operating into the 20th century and was sold for use as a private residence in 1905, and a private residence it remains today. So we will swap the Oak Hill School for the Brick School. In 1820, a lot was deeded to what became known as the Grove School on the east side of Brunswick Pike, somewhere near the future site of the D&R Canal. The Grove School later moved to the west side of Brunswick Pike on Franklin Corner Road near today's Lawrenceville Gardens apartment complex. The Grove School continued operating into the 20th century and eventually was replaced by School Number 4. Here's an 1843 notice of a community event being held at the Grove School. Sounds like fun. Meanwhile, in Clarksville, we know there was a school operating there because they were advertising for a teacher in 1836. This was fairly typical. The school would be operated by a small group of local trustees who would hire the teacher and maintain the facilities, and each school was its own district. Clarksville School was near the intersection of today's Clarksville and Quaker Bridge roads on land that is now an access road for the Quaker Bridge Mall. This school also continued operating into the 20th century, and this shows the Clarksville School in the early part of the 20th century with the dirt of Quaker Bridge Road in front. This schoolhouse design was very simple, and as we shall see, most of Lawrence's early schools looked almost exactly like this. There was also a school serving North Lawrence. It was called the Cold Soil School up until around 1878 or so, and from then on it was called the Rosedale School. So this site plan, dated 1923, shows the location of the Rosedale School lot on Cold Soil Road across the street and a little bit north of the Terhune Orchard. We don't know when the Cold Soil School began, but it does appear on an 1849 map and is referenced in an 1846 ledger. Now, what did all of these early schools have in common? They were all one-room schoolhouses with one teacher serving today's grades K through 8. There were no particular qualifications for teachers, just whoever the school trustees thought could do the job for the salary they were offering. And these schools were also irregular. If the teacher quit, school would be closed until a new one was hired. If they ran out of money, they would close until they got some money. And here is where we first encounter the question of who gets to go to school and who has to pay for it. The answer in these early days was that the parents paid for it, and you got to go if your parents could afford it and thought it was a good idea. So these schools were not public in any modern sense. The buildings were not public buildings, and the land was not public land, and the funding was not public funding. Parents paid tuition to hire the teacher, and parents also put up the money to buy the land and build the building. It was just over 200 years ago, in 1817, when the New Jersey legislature set up the first state-level school fund to provide towns with money to pay for the education of children who were too poor to afford tuition. In Lawrence, the first record we have of this was in 1828, when Township Council voted $100 for the schooling of children who were unable to afford tuition. The following year, 1829, the New Jersey legislature passed, and this guy, Governor Isaac Williamson, signed the state's first law governing public education. This act was modified many times over the following years, but eventually townships were required to elect a school committee. The first licensing rules for teachers were put into place, and towns were given the authority to levy taxes to offset the cost of tuition. In 1839, there were 1,200 school districts in New Jersey, about twice as many as we have today. That year, education expenditures in our state totaled $212,000, of which 65% came from tuition and the rest from state funds and local taxes. Lawrence elected its first township school committee in 1834. So here are Lawrence Township schools in the middle of the 19th century: Clarksville, Grove, Central, Brick, and Cold Soil. And these five would continue to serve the children of Lawrence for the next 50 years. I do need to point out that in 1846, school district boundaries did not conform to township boundaries. Some students from Lawrence attended school in other townships, such as Ewing. The Ewingville School was near the corner of Ewingville Road and Eggert's Crossing Road. In Hopewell, the Federal School was near the corner of Lawrenceville Pennington Road and Federal City Road, and near the parking lot for the soccer fields. And in Princeton, the Creek or Stony Brook School was on today's US 206 on the Princeton side of the Stony Brook Bridge. And I'll tell you more about this in a few minutes, but there was also a school in Milham, in what was then South Lawrence, but is today North Trenton. This 1849 map of Mercer County shows most of these schools. Here's Central, and here's Cold Soil, and Clarksville. You might have guessed that SH stands for schoolhouse on the map. Grove School at Baker's Basin, Brick School or Valley School, plus Ewingville in Ewing, and Federal in Hopewell. So here we are at mid-century, in the mid-19th century, and we are ready for second period. In the 1840s, there were several developments that would set the pattern for public education in Lawrence Township for the rest of the century. In 1844, New Jersey ratified a new constitution that provided for the state school fund in perpetuity and eliminated the property requirement for voting. Then in 1846, the legislature passed what became known as the Great Common School Law. It established the office of State Superintendent of Schools, increased funding, and allocated state money according to population. It also set requirements the townships had to meet in order to receive funding, and that meant that Lawrence had to get itself organized. In 1847, at the annual town meeting, the voters of Lawrence elected the township's first superintendent of schools, Samuel M. Hamill. There he is, S.M. Hamill, elected in superintendent of common schools. Sam Hamill was a well-known local educator who also happened to be the proprietor of what is now the Lawrenceville School. Here's Sam Hamill. He ran the Lawrenceville School from 1837 to 1877, 40 years. So let's just say he was moonlighting as superintendent of the common schools. Sam Hamill's first term lasted only a few years, but he was briefly reappointed as superintendent again in the 1860s. The next few years saw the formal organization of the 5 school districts of Lawrence. In 1851, the Central School District was officially incorporated. That same year, township residents voted to raise the sum of $2 a year per student via taxation to help offset the cost of tuition. At that point, no Lawrence schools were free. That would not happen for a couple of decades. And this brings us to the subject of school taxes. And I can assure you that they were as popular then as they are today. And as evidence, I offer up a farmer by the name of George Phillips, who lived in Lawrence in the mid-19th century. We have quite a lot of insight into George's life because we have his handwritten diary spanning many years. And he had strong opinions about our questions this evening: who gets to go to school and who has to pay for it. In May of 1856, Lawrence's Central School District wanted to build a new school building. And in his diary, George Phillips had this to say: "Thus it seems to me, quote, the cause of education imposes a burden on society against their consent, that it interferes and infringes on private rights, and is a great leveler. It tends to break down the distinctions in society. Thus the children of the Irish bog trotter, the descendant of a Hottentot, or children of our paupers, are placed on a level with those whose parents by persevering industry, economy, and management transmitted a goodly heritage to their posterity. The rabble invariably go for the largest amount of money to be raised by tax. The landholders pay nearly all the tax that is raised in our township, and even among them, it is narrowed down to a very few who pay the greatest part of our tax. Educate a pauper, and he will scarcely ever do common labor. Yet the farmers are compelled by a vote to raise money that they will know will be against their interest. Who is to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water?" Unquote. Like many farmers of his time, George Phillips was worried that he would suffer from a shortage of farm hands if everyone went to school. He thought that school money would be better spent on improving the roads. But as noisy as they may have been, George Phillips and the anti-school factions were in the minority. In 1856, Sam Hamill saw to it that funds, $1,200, were appropriated to build a new building for the Central School District on the Main Street site of the previous school. And in 1871, New Jersey passed what they called an act to make free the public schools of the state. So free they became for the first time. The following year, we have this report on a meeting of Lawrence Township voters at the Grove School. Some of the resolutions that were adopted: that while we are willing to pay tax sufficient in connection with the school fund to make our schools free, we are not willing to pay an unnecessary tax more than is required for that purpose. That we are not willing to be taxed to pay any high salaried superintendents, believing such an officer to be uncalled for, as we believe the trustees of each district to be capable of selecting their own teachers. That the normal school is an increasing tax upon the state without any material benefit, and should be sustained by its patrons as other high schools are. Be more about the normal school in a moment. And finally, quote, that we will use all endeavors to so amend the school law so as to do away with all high salaried officers and thus greatly lighten the enormous tax we are now compelled to pay. One of the great ironies of our friend George Phillips is, though he complained loudly and regularly about the public schools, he had no problem when it came to sending his own daughter, Frances Emmeline Phillips, to the New Jersey Normal School in Trenton so that she could train to become a school teacher. The Normal School was founded in 1855 by State School Superintendent John Phillips of Hopewell, probably a distant cousin of George, in order to provide more and better teachers. The school was free, but graduates had to promise to teach in a public school for at least 2 years after graduation. The Normal School eventually became Trenton State Teachers College, which is now the College of New Jersey. I promised to discuss what is known of the Milham School District. Some of you probably know the Milham story. If you don't, the library's YouTube channel has the video from an online lecture on the subject that I gave last spring. Until 1882, the Milham neighborhood was at the southernmost tip of Lawrence, butting up against Trenton. It is today the section of Trenton to the east of Brunswick Avenue and north of Spruce Street, as well as a large tract on the east side of the D&R Canal in East Trenton. So this was Milham. All of that was once in Lawrence. As Trenton expanded after the Civil War, Milham became a center of the pottery industry, and it grew rapidly. In 1882, Milham seceded from Lawrence and became an independent municipality, but that only lasted until 1888, when the city of Trenton officially absorbed two of its independent neighbors, one being Milham and the other being Chambersburg. We can see here on this roster that just before the Civil War in 1854, the Milham School District was home to 44 of Lawrence's 546 school children. By 1866, they had 123 of 634. And by 1879, shortly before they declared independence, they had 271 of 571. And the question is, where did these 271 children go to school? The short answer, I think, is most of them did not go to school. To orient you, this yellow part here is the former Milham, after it was absorbed into Trenton to become the 8th Ward. This is Brunswick Avenue over here. Here's the DNR Canal up and down here, and here is the Assunpink Creek. The earliest record of a school in Milham dates to 1847, and it was said to be on Mulberry Street, but we don't know where. In 1866, the Milham district purchased land and constructed a school over on Dickinson Street. This served the district until Milham became independent, and then the residents built a new school over here on Girard. This is not shown on the map. After Milham was absorbed into Trenton in 1892, a new school was built at Brunswick and Mulberry, the site of today's Copeland, formerly Columbus School. Here's an 1884 notice of sale of the old Milham Schoolhouse on Dickinson Street. This indicates that the building was 26 by 90 feet, which means it might have been big enough to contain 2 classrooms for 271 students, but we don't know. Anyway, the effect of Milham's secession on the population of Lawrence Township was spectacular. The 1890 census showed that we had lost half of our citizens, and it would be many decades before we grew back to that size. And now we move on to third period, which I call the Red Queen. 1894 was the year in which the Lawrence public school system assumed the form that still exists today. This was the year of the great school consolidation statewide. In 1894, the New Jersey legislature gave townships centralized authority over all of their schools, and in one fell swoop, the number of school districts in New Jersey dropped from 1,408 to 374. And in Lawrence, the number of school districts dropped from 5 down to 1. The 5 individual school boards were dissolved, and the new Lawrence Township Board of Education took control. This 1894 entry is the first mention of the Board of Education of Lawrence Township that was mandated by the new law. And this newly formed school board wasted no time. Their first major act was to order up a new school building for Rosedale. This would not be the last one-room schoolhouse to be constructed in Lawrence, but eventually it would be the very last one-room schoolhouse to remain operating. In 1899, the board voted to replace the one-room central schoolhouse on Main Street with a new two-room schoolhouse on Phillips Avenue. So here's Phillips, and here's Gordon, and here's where the new public school was. The original school was a little bit uphill and a little bit closer to Phillips Avenue than the current Lawrenceville Elementary School building. They financed the new school by selling the old one. They sold the land under the old schoolhouse to the Lawrenceville School and sold the school building to a local merchant who moved it over to Phillips Avenue, where it remains to this day, although in highly modified form. Hiding in there somewhere, though, is the 1856 Central Schoolhouse that made George Phillips so angry. Meanwhile, the South Lawrence neighborhoods near Trenton began to grow. The first subdivision in the area was Slackwood, which was created in 1890. In 1899, the first trolley service from Trenton to Lawrence began operation, making it convenient for a Trenton worker to live in Lawrence and commute to his job. As a result, the old brick school on Princeton Pike was over capacity, and Lawrence was forced to pay tuition to Trenton to send dozens of children to the Columbus School. Something had to give, and in 1904 it did. For the first time, the Lawrence Board of Education asked the voters for authority to borrow money to build a school, and the voters approved a $4,000 bond issue to build the first Slackwood School, which was of wood frame construction and contained 2 classrooms. In 1905, the brick school was closed and the children transferred to Slackwood. It wasn't long before Slackwood was bursting at the seams, and in 1909 it received the first of many additions. The entire school was jacked up so that the old first floor became the second floor, and a new first floor made of brick was constructed underneath. With 4 classrooms, this made Slackwood the largest school in Lawrence. 2 years later, in the village, what had become known as the Lawrenceville Public School was also expanded by 2 rooms, becoming our second 4-room schoolhouse. 1909 also saw construction of an unusual school that recalls one of the questions we started with. Who is to be educated? Who gets to go to school? And who has to pay for it? These questions arose starting in 1904, when the Children's Home Society purchased a building in Lawrence, shown here on this 1919 map. At the turn of the 20th century, the mission of the Children's Home Society was to take in orphaned or otherwise homeless children and place them with families. While waiting for placement, the children were under the care of the society. The building on Brunswick Avenue that was purchased by the society was to be used for that purpose. The children would live there while waiting for a permanent family placement. The building was quickly expanded and became known as the McKinley Receiving Home. Most of the time, there were between 50 and 100 children living there. Most only stayed for a few months. One obvious question then is, where were these children supposed to go to school? They weren't from Lawrence. For the first few years, the answer apparently was they did not go to school. We don't know exactly how it all came down, but we do know that near the end of 1909, the Lawrence Township Board of Education received a notice from New Jersey's Attorney General, Edmund Wilson Sr. There's Ed. He had ruled that Lawrence was responsible for educating these children and must make provisions to do so. Edmund Wilson Sr., by the way, was the father of the notable literary critic Edmund Wilson Jr. So this ruling established the principle that school districts are responsible for educating all of the children within their borders, a question that still arises from time to time for homeless families living in temporary housing. So in 1909, the board voted to lease a plot of land on the grounds of the McKinley's home and to build a 1-room schoolhouse there and to hire a teacher. This became known as the home school, which is not to be confused with homeschooling, and it continued in operation until 1922, when Children's Home Society closed the McKinley home and moved to a facility at Trenton. In 1922, the Lawrence School Board moved the 1-room home schoolhouse a short distance to serve as an annex to Slackwood School, which has ever needed the space. This 1926 photo is the only image we have of the homeschool building. Pardon me while I fiddle with my microphone here. All right. This newspaper account from 1909 concerns the public vote on the homeschool, but it also contains an interesting footnote concerning another of our original questions: who gets to decide? You will see here at the bottom that it says the women are entitled to vote at this election. This is 11 years before the 19th Amendment providing for universal suffrage, so why were women entitled to vote at school elections? The answer goes back to 1873, when women in New Jersey became eligible to serve as school trustees. In a fine bit of political logic, women could serve as trustees, but were not allowed to vote for trustees. This changed in 1887, when women were granted the right to vote in school elections. And then in 1894, the New Jersey Supreme Court turned around and ruled that this was unconstitutional, that women could not vote in school trustee elections, but could still vote on school taxes. So here in Lawrence, apparently 1909, it was a vote on school taxes that was permitted for the women. The 1920 census showed that Lawrence was now on a rapid population growth trend and had gained back everything lost to Millam and then some. And most of this was due to the new trolley lines and new subdivisions like Eldridge Park. It had begun selling lots in 1906 and was conveniently located between the two trolley lines serving Lawrence, and it was clear that it needed its own school. In May 1912, voters were given a choice of building either a two-room school or a new four-room school for Eldridge Park. And you can probably guess what they chose. In 1913, the two-room Eldridge Park School was opened. They should have gone for four rooms because 2 years later, in 1915, the board realized the school was too small and ordered up two more classrooms, which were built on top of the original. If you look at the school facade of Eldridge Park from Meadowbrook Avenue today, you are seeing the original four classrooms. These are the oldest classrooms still in use in the Lawrence Public Schools. In reaction to parent demand in 1918, the Grove School at Baker's Basin was closed. The Grove children were transferred to Slackwood, but the now empty one-room Grove School building was moved in 1920 to Eldridge Park because, as always, they needed the space. You can see it here. These were the modular classrooms of their day. In 1922, only 9 years after it was built, voters would approve an 8-room addition to Eldridge Park that tripled the size of the school, the Grove School Annex, and here are the 8 new classrooms behind the original 4. In 1916, voters approved 4 more rooms for Slackwood. Here's what that looked like. They were built in front of the original 4 rooms. Closing a rural school like Grove over by Baker's Basin meant that 50 to 60 students needed to be transported to their new school at Slackwood. This is not an image of Lawrence, but rather of nearby Washington Township, now Robbinsville, but it shows the children lined up to board their horse-drawn school buses in 1912. Lawrence had been paying for school transportation by horse cart since at least 1903, but when we closed the Grove School in 1918, we decided to become transportation innovators. Lawrence was the first district in Mercer County to specify that they wanted transportation only by automobile bus for the 50 to 60 former students of the Grove School. The trolley systems were also important for student transportation, not only to bring high school students to Trenton and to Princeton, but also for transportation within Lawrence. Because of its proximity to the trolley lines, the Lawrenceville Public School had a large number of its students arriving by trolley. The school district began buying trolley tickets in bulk in 1912. You may have figured out that I named this third period the Red Queen after the character from Alice Through the Looking Glass, whose famous line was, "It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." And that was certainly the case for Lawrence. With the continued rapid growth in population, the Lawrence School Board was very much in that situation and needed to do some planning. So they did what any self-respecting board would do. They hired a consultant. In this case, it was Teachers College at Columbia University, who issued their report in 1922. First, the report showed exactly how crowded the schools were. The 8 rooms of Slackwood were serving 320 students. Lawrenceville School was renting a room in the firehouse. Eldridge Park was using the old Grove School building, and the 8 new rooms there were not yet ready. The Lawrence School Board could not have been too happy with some of Columbia's other findings. Number 1, the school system of Lawrence Township is poorly organized and poorly administered. Responsibility is not fixed, nor is efficient service required. Number 4, the children of Lawrence Township are intellectually capable, but in their classroom work, they are not doing as well as children of similar ages or grades are doing elsewhere. Number 10, the recording and reporting system, both financial and educational, fails to conform to modern standards. Number 11, proper standards of cleanliness are not maintained in the present buildings. I could go on, but you get the idea. Columbia made several recommendations, including increased use of what we would now call standardized tests to measure how the scholars were doing. They also recommended a new, larger school for Lawrenceville, a new school at Baker's Basin, and a new junior high school. So let's see how we did with these recommendations. Well, standardized tests were definitely in. School reports from the 1920s are filled with pages and pages of this kind of stuff. As for the new school in Lawrenceville, the school board proposed to build a 10-room schoolhouse on property owned by the prep school between Main Street and Louisville Road. And in February of 1923, the voters said, thanks, but no thanks. Then, one short month after the no vote, disaster struck. Despite being across the street from the fire station, the Lawrenceville Public School burned to the ground. Almost 200 children had to continue their education in makeshift classrooms at the Presbyterian Church, at the Lawrenceville School, and at the firehouse. The new replacement, the 8-room Lawrenceville Public School, was constructed in 1923. And here you can see it on the hillside overlooking the village. So, as recommended by Columbia, Lawrenceville got its new school after all. A third Columbia recommendation was a new school at Baker's Basin, and in 1925, the 4-room school number 4 on Brunswick Pike was opened. Its site is now occupied by the south parking lot of the Toyota dealership. At the same time, the 1-room Clarksville School was finally closed, and those children transferred to school number 4. The citizens of Lawrence did not know it at this time, but after school number 4, it would be almost 30 years before the township built another new school. And that makes this a good time to end our third period. Having followed through on many of the Columbia recommendations, 5 years later, the Lawrence School Board decided to do its own internal evaluation. In 1927, they produced an illustrated report containing a wealth of data on the state of the schools and plans for the future. However, this report touched on a few additional topics that had not been addressed by Columbia's Teachers College. And these go straight to our original questions of who gets to go to school and where. What the school board did was to propose construction of a segregated school for African American children. Segregated schools had been operating in Princeton and Trenton for 50 years or more. However, in Lawrence, black and white children had always gone to school together. The question is, why suddenly had this become an issue? I can tell you that Lawrence was not alone. In the 1920s, the Great Migration was in full swing, in which millions of African Americans from the agricultural South moved north in seek of factory jobs. The late New Jersey historian Howard Green found that around this time, many districts that had never been segregated offered up plans to open separate schools. What he found was that throughout New Jersey, as long as the African American school population remained under 10%, districts were generally willing to maintain the status quo. But as soon as the percentage began to climb beyond 10, the question found its way onto the agenda. As a practical matter, it meant that there were now enough African American students to fill a school building of their own. And these Lawrence data support Howard Green's thesis. The African American population of Lawrence's schools had begun to creep above 10%. It was 11% November 1st, 1926, and 100 black school children were more than enough to fill a building of their own. At Lawrenceville Elementary in particular, 1/4 of the students were African American, as you can see in this 1922 class photo. This was taken in front of the original LES, the one that burned down. Lawrence never did officially become segregated, although some African American students from Lawrence were forced to attend a segregated junior high school in Trenton when they were sent there for 9th grade. Despite their intentions, the Lawrence School Board did at least acknowledge the state of the law at the time, which was that in principle, segregated schools had been illegal in New Jersey since 1881. Quote, it must be borne in mind, however, that the segregation of pupils because of race differences alone is illegal and can be undertaken only with the consent of the interested parties, unquote. In practice, of course, it was a different matter. Segregation would persist in New Jersey until 1944, when two African American moms named Gladys Hedgepeth and Berline Williams filed suit against the Trenton School Board. The New Jersey Supreme Court ruled in their favor and put an end to school segregation in New Jersey. After Hedgepeth Williams, both Princeton and Trenton finally desegregated their schools. Hedgepeth and Williams now have a school in Trenton named after them. Another question of who gets to go to school was raised in the 1926 report. It concerned what today we would call special education. It, Once again, Lawrence brought up the subject but did not take any specific action. It would not be until federal legislation in 1975 that disabled children were guaranteed an education. But the main thrust of the 1927 report was support for one of the main recommendations of the Columbia report 5 years earlier, and that was that Lawrence needed a junior high school. The preferred location would be along US 206 near the trolley line in Eldridge Park. The junior high school question became front page news. This article from 1927 shows the plan for the proposed junior high right here, along with pictures of Slackwood right here, Eldridge, and the Rosedale School. And it notes as well that the schools are improving. Taking no chances, the Lawrence School Board went out to get a third opinion. And this time they engaged the New Jersey Department of Education to do a facility study. That report came back in 1929 and supported the recommendation to build a junior high school. The school board was ready to go to the voters. The proposed referendum included plans for both the junior high and an 8-room addition to Slackwood. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. 3 months later, in January of 1930, Lawrence voters went to the polls and soundly defeated the junior high school plan. The vote was 573 to 297. But the school board was not ready to give up. 4 months later, they went back to the voters, but this time they split the plan into its individual elements and allowed a yes or no vote on each one. Once again, the junior high plan would go down to defeat, but this time the 8-room expansion at Slackwood was approved. The Slackwood plan included demolition of the oldest sections of the school, including the original 2-room wooden frame building, which was now part of the second floor in the back. As you look at the Slackwood building today, the oldest parts from 1916 are on the north side and the 1930 additions on the south side. During the Great Depression and the war years, the population of Lawrence leveled out and the school board could catch its breath. In 1936, after many attempts, the board was finally able to close the Rosedale School and move those students to Lawrenceville. For decades, the parents of the Rosedale neighborhood had favored maintaining their 1-room schoolhouse. The land and building were sold and are now in use as a private residence on Cold Soil Road. In 1938, looking to keep stimulating the economy, the federal government came calling and offered to pay 45% of the cost if Lawrence would only just build that junior high school. This was an offer too good to refuse, so again the school board took it to the voters, who responded with a loud and clear no, 814 opposed, 216 in favor. Also in 1938, the New Jersey State Teachers Association, which had been the professional society of school teachers since the middle of the 19th century, voted to change its name to the New Jersey Education Association. In 1944, a local chapter was formed to be called the Lawrence Township Education Association. And in 1946, a Lawrence resident by the name of Fred Hipp took over as executive director of the New Jersey Education Association, a job he would hold into the 1970s. I can see the teachers in the audience genuflecting right now. Under Fred Hipp's leadership, the NJEA grew into the organization that it is today. The high point of his career came in 1968 when the NJEA persuaded the New Jersey legislature to override Governor Hughes's veto, thereby securing collective bargaining rights for school teachers. And so it is time to move to fifth period. You probably know the post-war story of Lawrence, the proliferation of suburban housing and the influx of young families. For a school board that has spent the past 25 years conducting business as usual, this was quite a wake-up call. With the population growing again and economic prospects looking up, in November of 1950, the Lawrence School Board again decided to go to the voters to seek approval to build a junior high school. And they say the fourth time's the charm, something like that, because this time it worked. The vote was 907 in favor of the junior high and 601 opposed. And in the fall of 1952, Lawrence Junior High School opened for business, serving grades 6 through 9. This was the first new school to open in Lawrence since 1925. But the school board could see that this was just the beginning. In 1954, voters were asked to approve further additions to Lawrenceville and to Eldridge Park. And after decades of saying no to almost everything education related, starting with the junior high, voters began a long run of saying yes, adding a modern wing to LES that opened in 1955 and another to Eldridge Park. Then in 1956, families began moving into the first of many new subdivisions in central Lawrence. This was Nassau Estates. You may know that until Lawrence High School was built, Lawrence students of high school age either went to Trenton or to Princeton, depending on where they lived. This practice stretched back to the early years of the 20th century. We don't know exactly when the first high school students from Lawrence started going to Trenton, but there are records of tuition payments to the Trenton School District as early as 1907. Later on, students in North Lawrence began attending Princeton High School. But starting in the mid 1950s, it began to look like Lawrence was going to give Princeton more than it bargained for. With Nassau in its name and the orange and black colors and academic motifs chosen for its brochure, it was obvious that Nassau Estates had a strong orientation in the direction of Princeton. In 1956, the north-south dividing line in Lawrence was Dara Lane. If you lived south of Dara Lane, you went to Trenton Central High School. If you lived north of Dara Lane, you went to Princeton. And wouldn't you know it, Nassau Estates was developed on the north side of Dara Lane and thus able to tell families that their teenagers would attend Princeton High School. But it only took Princeton about a year to take away the punch bowl. In October of 1957, the Princeton School Board notified Lawrence that they would stop taking new students from Lawrence effective with the 1959-1960 school year. At that time, Lawrence had 80 high schoolers at Princeton and 170 at Trenton. This added a new wrinkle to the planning equation as the Lawrence School Board looked to the future. It was becoming increasingly clear that Lawrence would need its own high school. Meanwhile, in 1959, the voters said yes to additions to Slackwood and to the junior high school, which was then only 7 years old and already running out of space. Here's the new wing at Slackwood, which opened in 1961, and here are the substantial additions to the junior high school, also dating to 1961. In 1959, voters also approved the acquisition of a tract of land on Princeton Pike for a new elementary school. Benjamin Franklin Elementary School opened in 1961, and sure enough, 1 year later, the board realized Ben Franklin was too small, and in October 1962 went to the voters for 8 more rooms, which were approved. By this time, Norgate, Nassau II, Pine Knoll, University Park, and other new subdivisions were in the works, and the Lawrence School Board knew they needed help. You should note on this photograph from around 1961, here this is Princeton Pike. Here's the new Ben Franklin Elementary School, and here is the vacant land on which Lawrence High School would eventually be built. So once again, they turned to an outside consultant to do a study, in this case, the School of Education at Rutgers University. Rutgers delivered their report in the summer of 1962, and not surprisingly, its number one recommendation was that Lawrence have its own high school. And so the planning began. With knowledge of many failures to get voter approval for the junior high, the board began a public relations campaign on behalf of the new high school. But this time it was different. Everyone still worried about taxes, but our culture of education was changing. Many of the families moving into the new subdivisions in central Lawrence had moved here with good schools on their mind. This was new. When voters were first contemplating the junior high school in 1930, I doubt there were many parents who would say they chose where to live based on the quality of the public schools. So on May 21st, 1964, the voters approved construction of Lawrence High School, and it opened for students in the autumn of 1966. Meanwhile, the babies kept coming, and once again overwhelming the classroom capacity of the district. So the school board began planning for another elementary school. However, all of the new housing subdivisions had gobbled up so much local farmland that tracts of land large enough for a school were not so easy to come by. So the school board tried to carve out a piece of what is now Veterans Park to build the new school. But 2 days before voters were to go to the polls in December of 1966, they were slapped down by the New Jersey Department of Conservation. Turned out that because the land for the park had been purchased with state Green Acres money, it could not be used for a school. The following spring in 1967, voters were presented with a plan for a new school on Glen Avenue between Hoover and White Marsh, and for the first time in a decade, they said no. Finally, later in 1967, the Lawrence School Board secured a site between Reeder Avenue and Eggerts Crossing Road and began building their case for a new elementary school for grades 5, 6, and 7 using truly scary numbers. On November 28, 1967, the voters gave the go-ahead by a vote of 1,596 to 1,039. Lawrence Intermediate School opened its doors in 1970. You think about it, after going 25 years in which no schools were built, Lawrence built 4 new ones in less than 20 years: the junior high, Ben Franklin, the high school, and the intermediate school. Given this pace of construction, I suspect the voters who approved LIS in 1967 would have been quite surprised that Lawrence would never again build a new school. It's now been almost 60 years since LIS was approved. So with the intermediate school now open, there was no further need for school number 4, which was closed and demolished, but not before the school's Veterans Monument was moved to the Township Municipal Building. Which moves us to our last period, which I call From History to Memory. I'm not going to dwell on this period, as many of you remember at least part of it. Lawrence's population growth flattened out again between 1970 and 1980. After building so much in the 1970s, in 1978, the board was facing something new: overcapacity, and so closed Eldridge Park and leased the building to the Mercer County Special Services District. After decades of sending high school students out of district, Lawrence began accepting high school students from other towns, for a while from Cranberry and later from Washington Township. In 1981, labor relations reached a low point when the teachers went on strike for a week. And although Lawrence has not built a new school for almost 60 years, it's not for lack of trying. Anticipating population growth from new subdivisions in North Lawrence, in 1989, the school board tried and failed to acquire by eminent domain a piece of land at the corner of Louisville Road and Princeton Pike. To get more space, Eldridge Park was renovated and reopened in 1990. And in 1991, the voters defeated a plan to build a new elementary school on Danow Road near Sturwood Hamlet. And in 1997, they defeated another plan to build a middle school at Keefe Road and Cold Soil in what is now the Mercer Meadows Park. But on the question of further additions to existing schools, the voters have been more forthcoming. In the last 50 years, all of the buildings have been expanded and portable classrooms have been added and shuffled from school to school as populations grew and shrank. Most recently, voters approved plans for a major expansion at the former junior high school, now Lawrence Middle School. As elsewhere in America in the 1970s, Lawrence faced the dilemma of trying to achieve racial balance among its neighborhood elementary schools. In late 1969, Lawrence was instructed by the New Jersey Department of Education to improve its racial balance. At the time, Eldridge Park School was about 30% African American, and the other three neighborhood elementaries were about 3% each. A citizens committee was appointed to study the problem, and as a result, the catchment areas of the neighborhood elementaries were adjusted to achieve greater balance and have been subject to further adjustment as the years have gone by. This remains an area of concern to this day, although today the ethnic mix of Lawrence Township schools would have been unrecognizable to the school board of 1970. Not only black and white, but also Latino, Asian, Eastern European, and more. And I think I will leave it there, with thanks to you for attending back to school night, and thanks to the many individuals who helped me in researching this talk. And I will try to answer some questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I love that it is, because back to school night is happening everywhere right now. It's such a bit, it's perfect timing for this program. There's a couple questions that have come in through the chat. One of the things I wanted to clarify real quick is that Eldridge Park, it closed down completely and then it reopened again in the 90s. They renovated and reopened it.
Well, it was not closed. It was leased to the Mercer County Special Services Division district for their use.
Okay.
And then it was when that lease ran out, it was reclaimed.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
And then someone had asked, they asked, was the central school, when you're talking about central district, is that where the prep school is now, where Lawrenceville prep is?
Yes, the central school was located on a chunk of the Lawrenceville school camp. The Lawrenceville school campus, dates back to the early 19th century and was enormous as it is today. And so it was just a little chunk of it, a little bit south of where the Presbyterian Church is, was where that school was, across the street from TJ's.
Thank you. And another point, and I'm probably going to be mixing up surnames here, but you had talked about a house, I think it was one of the original 2-room schoolhouses that is now a home. It's somebody's home on Phillips Street, or was Phillips the...
Phillips Avenue, yeah.
Thank you. Is there any remnants of the school that's in that house that we know of, like a fireplace or anything?
I have not been inside the house. I have spoken with the owner of the house, who tells me that it's been highly modified over the years, but there are
Sure.
aspects of it on the inside where you can still see the original school building. Yeah.
I think that's awesome. I think that's pretty cool. And then another question that had come through is that you had talked at one point about how, and this is when Lawrence was transferring kids out of district to go to school, and you were talking about the segregation, and you were saying some of the Black kids went to Trenton High School, but you made it sound like not all of them had to go there.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. At the point at which all of Lawrence students had to go to high school in either Trenton or Princeton, there was some point in time when that happened, but I don't actually know what that was.
Okay.
When high school became mandatory and
Right.
it was required to do that.
Okay.
Or early 20th century sometime, but I don't know exactly when.
There are no more questions that have come through. I think we're all waiting for the test. They're going to be on the test. But I do want to thank you, as always, for providing such an educational lecture for all of us. I'm not from the area, so I thought it was fascinating. I do want to thank Laura, who was behind the scenes, making sure everything that was running smoothly, and for organizing this event, contacting you and getting this all set up and bringing that to the Mercer County Library System. To everyone who attended, I appreciate you hanging out with us tonight for back to school night, and I hope to see you at upcoming programs. Thank you again, Dennis. Always lovely working with you.
Thank you, Anna. Likewise. Good night, everyone.